Okay, we're back, and it's COMP100, Week 3, Lesson 3, Part 2. We just took a brief pause just to make sure everyone was on the same page with Visual Studio 2013. So not a big video for the first one. We did a bit of setup, and now we're going to go back into Visual Studio 2013 and make sure everyone's at this point. You're at this point right now? I'd like you to be. If you're not, and if you've already gone into a project or something like that, I want you to exit out of here. If you've already gone in, start Visual Studio again, and then I want you to go back to this start screen. Now you can set up Visual Studio in different ways. Mine is nice and white, but however, you can make it so that there's different themes you can use, whatever makes comfortable, and we'll go over that later on. So like I said, there's two pieces we're going to learn today. We're going to learn a bit of GitHub, to connect to GitHub and store our files up there, and what all that means, right? And we're going to learn a bit of Visual Studio, because you've never done this before, and we're going to explain what this Visual Studio thing is anyway. Visual Studio is the place where we're going to make all of our programs, all of our code is going to be done here. It's an IDE, an integrated development environment. It has the ability for us to write our code, compile our code, build our code, and deploy our code. Everything in one place. Way back in the day, when we were first programming, everything was on the command line. Like literally, there was no visual anything. There was just a text editor, and you put your code in a text editor, and you send it to the compiler through a command on the command line, right? And then it might compile, and it might give you an error. That's how it was back in the day, right? And then you'd have to recompile it over and over again. You have to look at your errors to figure out what's going on. And there was no code hinting back then or anything like that. Now, when you start typing it, what you're going to see when we start typing our first programs here in Visual Studio, there's going to be something called IntelliSense, code hinting, that's going to come up and suggest what we can write in there. So it makes it nice and easier for us to do stuff. Okay. The great thing for you guys, if you've never programmed, this is going to be your first step into the world, and you're going to figure out, hey, you know, some really cool things we can do with this little program. This little program is normally not free, although if you wanted to install it on your own laptop at home, let's say, or you brought it in your own laptop here, or your desktop, whatever, you could simply go to, all of us have access to something called, because we're all students at Georgian, or I'm a professor, but we all work with Georgian. You can go to our Georgian Centennial. Whew! My brain is Georgian today. We're students at Centennial College, and what we can do is we can go to Microsoft DreamSpark account here at Centennial, right? And it gives us access to download and install our developer tools, and one of them is Visual Studio 2013. You all have access to this. It's called DreamSpark, if you haven't seen it already. So if you wanted to install this on your own machine, you can simply do this by just clicking here, and it's going to give you options on how to install everything. And what I'd ask you to install, if you're going to do this install on your own, which, you know what, might not be a bad learning experience, is you want to download and install Visual Studio 2013 Ultimate, which is this one. Okay, Ultimate. There is also the 2015 preview. I don't recommend it right now. It's not ready. It will be, but it's just a different, earlier version of the code that's not quite up to snuff yet. It's good. There's some really good things about it, yes.
What's another example of like a program that people use to write code?
There's so many. There's tons of examples.
Is this the most famous one? Just what they use in like big corporations?
This is one of them. This is probably one of the biggest ones they use. Everyone uses Visual Studio to write stuff for Microsoft. And they also use Visual Studio to write other things, games as well, right? So if you wanted to use Visual Studio, for example, to write games on an Xbox, you can do that. You know, if you're a game programmer and you're making 3D games with Unity, the scripting side of things is done with Visual Studio, right? So Visual Studio is a massive program. It's 70 million lines of code, like literally lots and lots of development work. It's not a new program. It's a very mature IDE, right? So it's gone through many, many years of development, right? So this is something that's tried and true, and it's kind of a standard among developers who work in the Microsoft environment. If you're programming C#, F#, VB, even a lot of web stuff, you can do a lot of things in Visual Studio, and it's a good core standard. There are others. Like, for example, if you're doing things with Java, Visual Studio still so far isn't the best, right? You want to use something like Eclipse. That might be a more standard version of, or not more standard IDE for programming Java, right? So that's a different language. If you're using C++, Visual C++, Visual Studio is pretty darn good for Visual C++. You can also do it with Eclipse. If you're programming in other languages like Objective-C or Apple's new language Swift, then the Xcode IDE is pretty darn good if you're going to do like mobile development, right? If you're programming with Android, you're probably going to use Eclipse with Java again. So again, there's different IDE. I can keep going, right? But at the end of the day, there's just there's many IDEs, integrated development environments where you'd be creating your code. Here at the school, a lot of the stuff we do is going to be with Visual Studio and with C#. So this is why we're doing this course, right? But again, everything we learn here is all transferable to other courses and other things we do, right? So even though we're only learning C#, it's going to be our first steps for some of us into the world of coding. So this is where you download it. You go into this Microsoft DreamSpark for your Centennial account here, and you're going to go to Microsoft Visual Studio Ultimate 2013, download it. There's two versions that you can see here. One is the 32-bit English version, and one that includes with Update 2. It doesn't really matter which one you choose. If you add it to cart and download it and go through the process, that's one piece. And you should really, at the same time, also download and install Update 4, which is, that's what we're working on right now. That's what I have installed on my machine. And if you want to have your machine look like my machine with the same kind of things, Update 4, the minimum Update 3 is where you want to go, all right, if you're going to do it on your own.
Microsoft Update will do that automatically.
Sometimes it will not. You have to actually go into Visual Studio and you have to choose Update 4, right? This is where I recommend you go. Update 3 minimum. Okay, so you do that, you install things, it's running, and the environment will look like we saw before. It's going to look like this, right? And now we're going to start a new project. So let's go to new project. Do it with me.
Oh, where are you?
Go out again and go back to this piece again. I want you to come out again. If you have already done it, I want you to come out and do it all again with me. Don't assume anything because there's going to be some things, then you're going to be behind. Right? Okay, so new project. Let's go. Let's be all in the same place here. Go to Visual C#. Are you here with me? There's different options. These options here, I want you to take a look at. They're different templates for starting off a project. A blank app for universal apps. A Windows Forms application if we're going to create Windows applications. We're not going to do that during this time, right? A WPF application, which is a special types of window form with Presentation Foundation, a different way of doing things for Windows 7 and Windows 8. Console is where we want to do because it's the first application we're going to be creating console applications. On the bottom, there's some other options. One of them is the name of your application, right? Well, I'm going to call this COMP100, and I recommend you do the same, lesson 3, because that's where we're at. On the bottom right, you're going to have an option that says add to source control or something to do with source control. Mine says Git repository because that's the way I've set it up. Right? I'm going to add it to a Git repository because I'm going to be sharing it with you. For you, just leave this option, the bottom one, unchecked. Okay? You don't have to follow along this way. I'm going to press OK. When I do this, it's going to bring up this. Do you guys see the same thing? Yep. You guys see the same thing? You should. If you don't see the lines, because some people say, "Hey, I don't see the lines. These little lines here. I don't see these lines in your code." Right? It's okay. This is just my version of Visual Studio's fancy dancy. All right. One thing is you should see the line numbers. Do you guys see the line numbers in your code?
No, I don't.
If you don't, you got to go to Tools. Do this with me. You're going to go to Options, and you're going to roll down into where it says Text Editor. Right? It's one of these little arrows with a text editor next to it. And you're going to click on the arrow itself, right? And it's going to pull you down into these other languages. You're going to hit C#, click on the arrow, and click General. And then you have a bunch of little options. One of them is Enable Line Numbers, right? So line numbers right here. See it? There's also Navigation Bar, Automatic Brace Completion, Apply, Cut, or Copy. I've got a bunch of little commands here you may or may not have. One thing I'd like you to set up is the scroll bars. If you hit scroll bars, I've got I go down to behavior and I use map mode for my vertical scroll bar. And you can show preview tooltip with medium overview just to match what I see over here. There's also other options. There's off, narrow, medium, and wide. I find medium is pretty good. Narrow doesn't really help you. And large is too big, right? And what that is this scroll bar over here becomes really large, and I can go down, I can preview my code without actually clicking over here. Yes?
So here, is it a console application or?
Console application. See? You guys started the application already, and it's to go back and do it again. Like I said, so follow with me. Don't try and skip ahead.
Should we enable that? Use
Yes. So again, I'll go back. So if I go back to options, I want you to enable use map mode for vertical scroll bar. And I have it on medium setting. I recommend the same. I also have other things too, right? Like for example, from a general perspective, I have word wrap on. You don't have to have that. Word wrap means that if it's too long, it's going to wrap around so you can see what I'm doing, right? But for you, you don't have to really have that on, right? So there's a lot of different things here that I've got going on in my C# general settings that are, you want to try and match up so that you look fairly the same. IntelliSense is one of those. If you notice, your intelligence, your show completion list after a character is typed, you want to put that on for now under IntelliSense and C#. IntelliSense is what we use for code completion. So we start writing a bit of code, and all of a sudden it suggests 5 things you can do. It's really quite cool. So even if you don't know how to code, by starting to code, you'll learn. It'll teach you what to do. Okay, so you're going to press OK, and then you should have a bar that looks like this. Yes? Yeah? Okay, so this is the bar. So this is where we're at right now. So let's take a look at parts of the program, parts of the environment here, right, if you've never done this before. There's different windows. This window here is the editor window, right? The editor window has line numbers, and now that you've set that up, right? You may or may not have these little bars that go down between your braces. That's okay. Don't worry about that. You have some words on this page that mean something to the compiler, to the program here. For you, it means nothing, right now. There's also a gray gutter, which is on the left-hand side here. This gray gutter we use for debugging, troubleshooting, trying to figure out the problems in our code. You can actually click on here, and if you click next to a piece of code, as an example, what it'll do is it'll create a stopping point, right? And if you notice, it's right on this first piece here, this static void main piece. You can unclick that. I'm just showing you that you can click it and unclick it, and that kind of tells your code, when I get to a certain piece of code, I want you to stop. Now you can only click it when there's actually code. I can't click it anywhere. I can't click it up here. I can only click it right now next to main, where it says main. So this is your editor window. This is where all the coding happens, right? You also have a little output window on the bottom here where you can show some output. Errors, that kind of thing will come up here, show up here, and so on, right? On the top, you have your menus, and this is standard Microsoft menus. File, edit, view, project, build. These are all the same. If you've used Microsoft programs, any Microsoft program before, they're laid out almost exactly the same, right? So if you look at view, there's new and open and close. They do different things in this program, but at the end of the day, you know, if I go to the file menu, when I talk about going to the file menu, going to the edit menu, whatever, they're all up here. Again, I'm assuming you know nothing. If you know stuff, and if you're bored already, bear with me, because we're gonna ramp up quick, right? All right. We also have this little green button here that looks like a play button, right? This is how we build and compile our code, right, and run it. If you notice, if I click on the little down arrow, it says the only other option is attach to IIS, which we don't need to do. Start is when we start debugging our code, right, actually running it to see if it works. So this is the only tool you'll need right now. You also need to kind of do this too. If you notice, there's the quick buttons here, the icon bars, right? There's save and there's save all. May need to use that a couple times. There's open a file. We may need to do that, but probably not very much. So the icons here do almost exactly the same. And if you notice, when I highlight over them, they also give you the shortcut keys, a combination of keys you press to do the same function. So Control, Shift, and S would be save all, as an example. or you can go through the menu, Control, right, and it'll show you Control-Shift-S for the shortcut, right, to do that, or you can just click here. So there's a couple ways we can do it. Click here, or go through the menu for Save All, as an example, or Control-Shift-S. They all do the same thing. And the reason why we do that, and most application environments do that, is to give the developer, kind of however they want to do their stuff. It gives you flexibility to do it on your own way, right? And by the way, you can also customize this even more. So you can do things you can develop your own workflow. Okay, so that's kind of the toolbar in a nutshell. There's also other tools we're gonna access. I'm gonna tell you it sometimes to go to the window menu, or go to the view menu, as an example, or go to whatever menu. I'm going to tell you that, and then just do what I tell you to do. So this is the editor, the output window. On the right, you have something called Solution Explorer, but actually this is a window that has two tabs. One of them down here is Solution Explorer, and if you've connected to Source Control, you have another tab down here called Team Explorer. Now you may or may not see that if you haven't connected to Source Control, right? And Source Control being Git, which we just signed up for. I'm connected to it because I'm creating this new project. So I'm going to go to Team Explorer. You can watch me. You don't have to do this. I'm going to go to Changes, and I'm going to add a commit. And a commit, I want you to understand what that is a snapshot of my code the way it is right now, which is generated by Microsoft. I haven't done anything, right? But it's almost like a snapshot. And I can take different snapshots of my code as I develop, right? Yeah.
What's the difference between save and snapshot?
Saving actually saves it on your local system. When I build a repository on my computer, it saves my files in a specific folder that has additional capabilities. My folder not only just saves, but keeps track of the history of all the saves that have been done, so I can go back. So if I mess up something, I'm like, what did I do? It doesn't work anymore. I can go back. I can retreat back into a previous time for my code when my code was different. And I can also compare my code now to when I saved it last. That's what the revision control can do that.
We're going to use snapshot more than save probably.
No, you're going to do both. This snapshot is what I'm talking about. We call it a commit, right? And I'm going to and I have to add a commit message along with it, almost like a little description of why I'm making the snapshot or commit, right? So right now I'm creating a first basic project, right? And I can click commit once I add a little comments, right? What this does is it creates a snapshot locally on my system, right? Now I'm going to go back to my home. I'm going to go to unsync commits. And remember back then when I created my little repository online, I had this little URL. I'm going to go in here, copy, go back in here and paste it in this little space right here and press publish. What publish does when I click it is it connects with my remote repository online, right, and sends my files online, right? So now when I go back to my GitHub repository and I refresh, I have my files. So let's see if you can find me. Go to github.com/Tsiliopoulos, right, which would look like this. You might see this picture of me taken a couple years ago. I have less hair now and more gray than I used to be, but that's how it's pretty much me. I should probably update it. James got it? GitHub.com/my last name, TSILIOPOULOS. Yes? You can't spell it? It's okay. It's up. If you look up here, if you look at my picture, that's the way you spell it, right? So you can't go wrong. Once you start typing TSILI, it'll come up probably, right? TSILIOPOULOS. Okay, so now that you're up here, as an example, you're with me?
Let's look at Twitter page.
Are you there with me?
Yeah.
Okay. There's something called repositories. Click on repositories for me. If you go to repositories, you'll see the repository I just created, called COMP100 Lesson 3. Go there. Underneath there, if you actually look inside the files, this is going to be where you're going to see all your files. And if you want to, you can always download the zip to download the files we're working on today, right? That you can try them out on your own, right? So if you need to look at my course files and see, hey, how did he do that? What did he do? Let's take a look at his files. Instead of trying to figure out what I'm doing, it's better for you to try and follow along as much as possible. Even if you trip up and you can't do it, it's okay, because you always have my course files that are completed live as we go, right? So everything else, so if you actually click on one of these folders right here, like this COMP100 lesson 3, in there you have a program.cs file, and if you notice, it's exactly what I have right now in my Visual Studio, exactly, right? So if I go back to it, if I go back online, right, this and this are identical. When I update, which I'm going to do, I make a new commit, a new snapshot of what this is, and I connect with my online repository. I sync up with it, and all of a sudden all my files are up there again. Believe it or not, this is a very common developer workflow. We work, develop our code, and then when we get to a milestone, a stopping place, where we've done a little bit of work, maybe we're tired, we've worked for about an hour, half an hour, whatever it is, we come to a point where we added a little bit of different functionality to our code, right? We say, you know what, I want to save my code, I also want to update to GitHub. So I connect with GitHub, I do a commit, snapshot, I make a little commit message, I sync with GitHub, and I share my code there. So now, if my computer fails, if it burns, my dog eats it, gets thrown out the window, we have to leave really quickly, I got all my code. My code doesn't go away, right? It's always kept up to date. And from a collaboration perspective, if I want to work with you guys, I can add you as collaborators on GitHub and get you to work with me on the same code, right? That's the great thing about GitHub. So there's really some really good advantages from using it. We'll go over that again and again. Again, I'm going to hit this every time I have you guys. So if I have you again in Programming 2, I'm going to do the same song and dance. Hey, do you have a GitHub account? If you do, you can sign up and get a free point, blah, 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 right? Even if you have one already, maybe you haven't used it for a while, I'm going to keep doing it every single time because it's so important to do source control. We don't do enough version control, source control in the development environment. And most students who come out of Centennial or anywhere else, they don't know anything about it, or very little. And then they come out, and then their files are gone, and they get fried. Because when you're in business, you can't lose your files. You can't lose your code. And you're marked based on how you're able to create your code one time, right? It's always the motto for programmers is do it right the first time. If you have to go back and do it again and again, it's called rework, right? And the more rework you have, the more churn, if you will, the more poor of a programmer you are. Because it means you have to keep working at it and keep just doing things over and over again. Especially if you build things again and again, it's exactly the same. You should develop a toolbox of code over the course of your career that you can pull from and go, I got a piece of code like that. It looks like this. It's a code snippet, it's called. I can take this code snippet and slap it into my code. It's my code, and now I got functionality, and it took me 2 seconds as opposed to 5 hours of developing that code that you've tested and worked on for weeks, right, or whatever it is. Okay, lots of information there that I tried to give you all at once. So again, I've connected to GitHub. I'm going to start looking at this code and identifying some of it before we get into the lesson. Then I'm going to switch back and forth. I'm going to go PowerPoint, code, PowerPoint, code, PowerPoint, code. We're going to keep doing that over and over again to keep you from being bored. And another 5 minutes or so, I'm going to take a break. We're going to have a little conversation. I'm going to go up on my Centennial or eCentennial and throw together that Dropbox so you can put together your little text file to get your 1%, right? So again, I got this code. I've got my 2 tabs here. I've got Solution Explorer and Team Explorer. Solution Explorer is when I actually look at my files, right, for my project, right? I have a couple things here. I have something called a solution, which is this top level code right here, this top level line, right? And it shows that I only have one project in the solution. I can create many projects in my solution. Typically, I do one solution, one project. I don't ask you to do more than one, right? Although you could. I have another line here that's the project level. If I actually click this little arrow, it'll collapse the files here, so I won't show it. This is just the first project, which is COMP100. I named it COMP100-lesson 3. You can name it whatever you like, right? In here, we have a bunch of other sections that you should probably leave alone at this stage. Properties you don't want to touch, references you don't want to touch, app.config you don't want to touch. But this program.cs file is the file that's this one here. This is what this is, right? Now my files are saved in GitHub, my local GitHub account, my local folder that I've created. And you can put your files wherever you like, but I recommend you put them all in the same place every single time. Maybe it's your student files on your network drive, or maybe it's your thumb drive, that you put it on. Somewhere that's always the same every single time, so you keep track of all your lesson files. But again, worst case, you can always go on my GitHub account and drag them down, because it's going to be the exact same thing we're working on every time. Okay, but mine are on GitHub in my local folder called GitHub, not up online. I just created a GitHub folder. I called it GitHub, right? In here, I have a lesson called COMP100 Lesson 3. Let's take a look at what the lesson files look like locally and how they compare to what I see here. So here's my local lesson files, right? I've got this SUO file, an SLN file. This is the solution file. If you see something like this, you can actually double click, and if you notice the icon has changed color and it's added an icon that shows it's associated with Microsoft Visual Studio. If I double click on the solution, it'll actually launch Visual Studio, right? And actually this, the way it looks right here, I also have this little .git file, which tells me that this folder is a repository. It's a special folder that keeps track of all my changes, all my versions, right? It's not just like a regular folder on Windows, right? So if I go up online again, here's what my repository looks like, right? Here's COMP100 Lesson 3, and let's compare it to what it looks like in my folder. Almost identical, huh? See? Git attributes, git ignore, my COMP100 solution file, but I don't have this one, this SUO file. It doesn't show this one. In fact, it's probably been ignored because I don't need it. Okay? If I dig down into it, if I drill down into this COMP100-Lesson 3 folder and I do the same thing for my directory, right? Let's take a look at what I got. I've got a bin, an object, properties, app. I don't have a bin and object online. Those things weren't passed up here because there's probably nothing in them, or probably nothing of any consequence. I've never done anything with those files yet. But I do have this program.cs file, and this program.cs file, and this file are the same. But again, if I compare them to what I see here, it's different. Why am I showing you this? I'm showing you because you may think that the stuff you see here, you can actually see here and add a file here locally with a text editor. It won't work properly with Visual Studio. Visual Studio is not a text editor. Visual Studio is an IDE, an integrated development environment, which means the only way you can add files here is through Visual Studio, right? You can only do it with Visual Studio running. You can't do it. You can't add stuff into the folder like you normally would, like a drag and drop. It won't see it. It won't work properly. It has to be part of Visual Studio's manifest. So whenever you add it into Visual Studio through Visual Studio, it adds in a line in a properties file and an assembly file that says this file is part of our project. It's an XML file, right? So you can't. They don't look the same a lot of times. There's some files that we see here that you don't see here. So I just wanted to tell you that one. So that's Visual Studio in a nutshell. We haven't done anything yet. We just created a blank project, which is okay. And we're going to pause here for a 5-minute break so you don't glaze, right? And then if you need to go to the washroom, all that kind of stuff you can, and then we'll continue. This is at the 1 hour stopping mark, believe it or not.